Well, here in North Carolina, of course, we have seen so much economic growth and things happening in the state that we're very proud of and very happy about. And of course, because of the ideas that we've been advancing at the legislature and with policymakers in the governor's office, we like to believe that a lot of what we're talking about has really been getting through. People are embracing our ideas. They're actually becoming law. Reforms are being made, and North Carolina is growing. One of the people in state government who, of course, is intimately involved with all of the information and data about North Carolina is the state budget director, Andrew Heath. He became the budget director in February of this year, appointed, of course, by Governor Pat McCrory. He now manages the state's $22.3 million general operating budget. Now, previously, billion. Thank you. Thank you. You're right. Wouldn't it be interesting if it was million? That would be a whole nother Shaftesbury presentation. Previously, Andrew Heath served as chairman of the North Carolina Industrial Commission since 2013. Now, as chairman of that organization, he managed all aspects of the Industrial Commission's operations, ensuring proper administration of more than 75,000 workers' compensation claims that are filed annually. That sounds like a story in itself as well. He also presided as a hearing officer in appeals of workers' compensation and tort claims. So he's here today to give us an economic outlook and take a look at that $22.3 billion general operating budget, tell us exactly what we're spending our money on and what we might see in the future. Please welcome State Budget Director Andrew Heath.
However you want to do it. Thank you very much, Donna. Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay, I have a lot of information and a limited amount of time, so I'm really going to fly through this presentation. We can make it available to John Locke if you want to access it at a later date. And then I'll hold all the questions, if we can, until the end of the presentation. So this is sort of the North Carolina comeback in one chart or one slide. So here you have where we came from in January 2013 when the governor took office. 9.4% unemployment, $2.5 billion unemployment insurance debt because of our unsustainable model of unemployment insurance benefits. We had to borrow from the federal government. We had a personal tax rate of 7.75% and a corporate tax rate of 6.9%. Fast forward to about today, and we're at 4.9% unemployment. All 100 counties have lower unemployment today than when Governor McCrory took office. 300,000 jobs have been created. The unemployment insurance debt was paid off, and we now have a reserve that's pretty sizable and a more sustainable model so that when we have storms in the future, we can weather those storms. Personal tax rate has been reduced to 5.499% effective January 1st, affecting every taxpayer in the state. And then our corporate tax rate has been reduced to 3.0% beginning January 1st. And that is because we exceeded our revenue forecasts and revenue triggers. We have to give presentations to the credit rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's from time to time, most recently in connection with the Connect NC bond. We had the inaugural sale at the end of July for the first $200 million in bonds. And these are quotes that are pulled directly from the rating agencies' reports after we gave our presentation. Notably, we received pristine AAA ratings from all three credit rating agencies. We've held those ratings for about 10 years, but it shouldn't be taken for granted because some states have fallen off out of that ratings category. But if you look at these quotes, all of them say and make note of conservative fiscal practices or something like that. History of prudent fiscal management from S&P. Conservative financial operations from Fitch. So it's very important that we maintain this responsible budgeting and spending in the state not only because it's the right thing to do in terms of spending taxpayer money, but it has tangible results in terms of the rates that we get when we issue bonds. Our tax climate, kind of before and after 2013. Ranked 44th back in 2012. We're now ranked 15th, and we could possibly move up in the rankings yet again based on the activity that will happen in the first of the year. You can see in this chart just the tremendous amount of tax cuts that have been put into place since 2013 and will continue into 2017 and 18. Just tremendous tax savings. So $4.7 billion worth of tax cuts. That is real money. This is what the most of the press had to say about some of the tax cuts. The sky is falling, essentially, is how you could sum that up. Tax revenue down by nearly $300 million. Revenue down through the first third of the year. $190 million short of forecast. Excessive tax cuts causing red ink. And to my predecessor's credit, he said, don't worry, let's wait until some of these April numbers come in and see what they have to say. And as he usually is, Lee Roberts was right. This is, over time, the consensus revenue forecast and the actuals in terms of revenue. So the orange line there was the consensus revenue forecast that OSBM put in place with the General Assembly's consent. And we thought we'd have about 1.3% growth, and the actuals came in significantly higher. And that's what contributed to that $425 million revenue surplus that you may have heard about. I came into this position in February, and just in that short amount of time, the revenue forecasts had been upwardly revised 3 times. So first, we were expecting a $237 million higher than anticipated collection, then a $330 million surplus, and then when we got the year-end numbers, it was slightly over $425 million. And that's very important because, as we said earlier, there were triggers put in place to reduce the corporate income tax, and those triggers were met, and so the corporate income tax rate will go down to 3.0%, which is the lowest, will be the lowest in the nation among states that have that type of tax. So what drove all this revenue? In a climate where tax rates decreased and standard deductions increased, we attribute most of that surplus to income tax. And that is because so many more people are working and earning wages. So since 2013, the state of North Carolina, not the government, but the state of North Carolina, has created 300,000 jobs. And to put that into perspective, that's a job for every man, woman, and child in one of our largest cities, Greensboro, plus Davidson combined. So that is a lot of job growth in a relatively short amount of time. And we're getting some national accolades. So these are just sort of top 5 or 6. We're number 1 for business competitiveness, number 2, best state for business according to Forbes, number 3, best state for business, number 4, the 4th fastest growing economy in the nation in terms of GDP. The same week that we announced our $425 million revenue surplus, and I believe over 1,000 jobs were announced, and Virginia's revenues were $260 million below their forecast. CNBC upgraded us from number 9 to number 5 in terms of top states for business. So that was a very good week, and that was just a couple of months ago. North Carolina is outpacing the country in revenue growth in terms of year-to-date revenue growth. Moody's Investor Services puts out studies from time to time. That information is based on a May 2016 report that showed us outpacing the average of the 20 largest states by a 2-to-1 ratio. Very encouraging for North Carolina. It's important to put our economy into perspective in terms of where we stack up in both the nation and the world. So we are the 9th largest economy in the United States. Our GDP approaches $510 billion. We're the 23rd largest economy in the world, ahead of recognizable countries like Austria and Poland. So when you think of just going back to that, when you think of controversial policy and folks that like to say the sky is falling because a sporting event is moved out of state, would you think that the economies of Austria or Poland would be disrupted by controversial policies that don't directly impact business? I don't think you would. Or if they moved a soccer game out of their countries, would it affect their economic position in the world? Probably not. Other kind of anecdotal indicators. Our tourism is, quote, booming. And if you look at these quotes, these are very recent. So this is year to date. Hotel occupancy in Charlotte booming. That was from Charlotte Observer, August 5th. DPAC, which is Durham's Performing Arts Center, showing gains there as recently as July. Buncombe County hotel tax revenue, big tourist destination, and then our state attractions are all doing very well, showing increases year over year. So some of the impact of some of that controversial legislation that you hear about is not borne out by the numbers. So we've gone over sort of where we were, where we are, and that sort of sets the tone for how we were going to spend our money in terms of this year's budget for 16-17. So this sort of shows where we spend our money. As you can see, education is huge. Health and Human Services, multi-billion-dollar state budget. It increases when you include federal money. And then justice and public safety. So what that says about North Carolina is that we care deeply about education. We care about helping those that can't help themselves, and we want to have a safe state. When you think about cutting wasteful spending in state government, this surprised me. General government is that tiny little piece of the pie. When you take out education, health and human services, and justice and public safety, there's really, you could cut that entire budget and you wouldn't really be necessarily moving the needle. Now, that is not to say that I'm a proponent of wasteful spending, because I'm not, but it just kind of puts things into perspective. Within the education budget, higher ed is, K-12 is about 70%. Higher ed, we have a very robust university system, as everyone here knows, and then 8% about roughly is for community colleges. Within the Health and Human Services budget, Medicaid is the main driver there, and their enrollment and utilization rates impact the budget statewide, and so we monitor DHHS very carefully. So in terms of the budget that was enacted into law, there are really four themes. One is fiscal responsibility. One is sort of education, that's expressed in teacher pay to $50K. Historic teacher pay raises, college affordability, and then there's middle class tax cut in the form of the standard deduction increase, and then there was some investment into mental health and substance abuse. Starting with fiscal integrity, $473 million investment into the rainy day fund, bringing the total to $1.6 billion roughly, which I believe is the highest it's ever been in the state. That gets us to almost 7%, or maybe just over 7%, and we aspire to 8%, which is what we require of local government entities. So we're almost there, and I think, fingers crossed we'll get there next year. Those are sizable investments. And when you look at where we were, just a few years ago, I think we've tripled it. North Carolina teacher pay went from, I think, 21st in the nation to near the bottom, 46, 47%, not percent, but in the rankings, ranked 47th. And I would say that some of the reason for that is, it was a national recession. Why didn't our education rankings in terms of teacher pay hold constant if all the states were suffering a recession? And, just question whether or not the lack of an ample savings reserve account contributed to having to freeze or reduce teacher pay while at the same time those individuals were experiencing tax increases. So I think it's very healthy that we have such a large rainy day fund so that when future administrations experience an economic downturn, there will be money there. So on to teacher pay. Going back to fiscal responsibility, we had measured growth. So the state grows by about 280 people per day, which is kind of a staggering statistic. In fact, since we had the last major bond, which was for the university system back in 2000, the state has grown by 2 million people. And that is like taking the population of Nebraska and just plopping it in North Carolina. So we have a growing state. As we talked earlier, the state is the fourth fastest growing in the nation in terms of GDP, so we have a growing economy. With a growing economy and a growing state, we're going to have a growing state budget. Being a fiscal conservative, the governor wanted to make sure that we had measured growth in state spending, and so you saw roughly a 2.8% increase in overall state spending. When you just look at recurring dollars, about 2.3%. So that is under the rate of population plus inflation growth, and so that is within the range of responsible budgeting. Anyway, so turning to teacher pay, obviously the governor has had priority of compensating and rewarding teachers. With this budget, we can afford to pay the average teacher in North Carolina $50,000 when accounting for all funding sources, so that includes state and then local supplements. And if you factor in their benefits, total compensation, I believe, approaches $68,000 on average. So we anticipate that will bring us from about 41st into the 30s in terms of ranking nationally. Even before we invested all this money this year, the governor had already invested $1 billion in teacher pay, so this is not election year gimmickry. As you can see, that's where he took office, and the trend has reversed dramatically. Also on the education front, we wanted to try to make college more affordable. We have capped tuition increases. There's been a tuition freeze, and then a lot of experience has shown that schools will try to get around that by increasing the fees. So we've capped that at 3% annually. And then additionally, 3 of our our statewide system institution schools, Elizabeth City State University, Western Carolina University, and UNC Pembroke, will offer $500 per semester in-state tuition, which is really a pretty good deal for those universities. This budget features a middle-class tax cut, again expressed as the standard deduction increase, so it'll move up about $2,000, meaning that you pay no state taxes on the first $17,500 of income when this is fully implemented. About 75,000 taxpayers will fall off the tax rolls based on that, and as you can see, these families are really happy about that. And sort of final theme of the budget was mental health and substance use. The governor started the Mental Health and Substance Use Task Force. It's co-chaired by DHHS Secretary Rick Brazier and Chief Justice Martin. And it's really sort of designed to tackle this mental health issue that is a national issue but is also hitting us here in North Carolina, trying to treat it more as an illness, both for mental illness and for substance use as sort of a moral issue, I guess. At the forefront of this is the opioid epidemic. I think Wilmington was the #1 city in the United States for opioid overdoses. That's heroin and prescription drug overdoses. So you saw the governor sign a bill that provided access to a drug called naloxone, which counteracts the effects of an acute overdose episode. In addition to that, we invested about $20 million into the recommendations that the task force published during the budget development process. And some of the highlights there are a more robust case management system, emergency housing for folks that have these issues, drug and veteran treatment courts so that we can get these folks out of the jails and into treatment facilities, and then pairing that with transitional housing, we think will go a long way. And then sort of a Raleigh issue that has statewide implications. The Dorothea Dix property sale generated, I believe, about $40 million in income to the state, and $12 million of that has been appropriated in one-time funds to increase the number of mental health beds. So we're going to shift gears a little bit here. We want to talk about the Connect NC bonds. This was overwhelmingly approved by the voters in March. May not have been as popular among this group, I don't know. But it was a good time in terms of historically low interest rates, coupled with some real need to go after, a large bond initiative. And so this is sort of how the $2 billion is going to break down. As you can see, more than half of it is going to go to universities and community colleges. That is a huge asset for our state, the university system, the community college system. So we're going to see significant investment there. Within that pot, it's going to be targeted to science, technology, engineering, and medical classroom facilities. I was lucky enough to go to the first project groundbreaking, which was at App State University. The Beaver College of Life and Sciences is going to provide training to nurses and medical professionals there in that part of the state, so that's great. Less attractive investments in water and sewer infrastructure, about $300 million will go a long way. Leveraging our agricultural industry and our universities, some ag research investments. National Guard and public safety. So at the National Guard armories, they were so old and outdated that some of the garages you couldn't pull the vehicles into the garages to have them serviced. So anyway, this is sort of just a distribution of where the projects are. It's really designed to kind of bring the whole state up. I think about 70% of the counties are hit with at least one project. We had the inaugural sale at the end of July, and there were 6 bidders. We got total interest costs of, I believe, 2.079%, which is incredibly low. So this is, we don't want to be taking on a bunch of debt, but we are aggressively paying down the existing debt that we have, such that over a 5-year period, at the end of 2020, even with the $2 billion in Connect NC, will be below where we are today. So you can see that the trend line paying down the debt, and then this is sort of a anticipated schedule of bond sales. So the Debt Affordability Advisory Council, before the bond initiative went live, took a look at our debt service capacity. And so these are some sort of, the red line at the top is the ceiling. That's the maximum amount we could have. And then some scenarios. Existing debt is the blue line, then some scenarios at different rates. And as you can see, we'll actually be below this green line, since we got just over 2% total cost of interest. Year one, sort of like the entire distribution, most of it's going to go to education, and then some laggers in public safety, agriculture, and state parks and the zoo. Just a representation of how we're going to spend. As you can see, universities and community colleges are going to sort of reap the benefits of year one investments. This is the outlay for the bond project, for the bond initiative. So this is year one. We authorized up to $200 million. We anticipate, based on the cash needs of the projects, that we'll spend about $184 million. A lot of that in the first year, because the reason it's so low, a lot of that is invested into planning and design, which will fuel construction projects going into years 2, 3, and 4, and then it will ramp back down. So that's why it sort of isn't a flat distribution over the years. Okay, so we've looked at where we were, where we are now, some spending in the budget, Now I want to try to get out the crystal ball a little bit and talk about where we might be headed. Full disclaimer, a lot of this is based on a presentation that I saw last week in Montana at the National Association of State Budget Officers. Presentation by Rick Mattoon, who's the senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He had a great presentation, and I thought I'd share a lot of that with you. So it looks like nationally we're heading into just sustained moderate growth in the next couple of years at about 2%. But he did say that there would be pockets of strength and weakness. And so the question is, will North Carolina outpace or lag? And he sort of had a few areas that we could look at to make that determination. What's going to drive demand or growth? Is it going to be consumer sector, business sector, international market influence, or domestic government? So in terms of sort of an optimistic look, job gains, so employment and mix of employment are improving, and we see that is consistent in North Carolina as well, as you saw with the 300,000 jobs that we've added in the last few years. Wages are beginning to be a little bit higher. And so when you have higher wages, more people working, and a decline in energy and gas, you see a little bit of consumer spending that's available. And so perhaps that might lift us a little bit. On the flip side, we have weak foreign markets. So Europe pushing quantitative easing or negative interest rates. Don't expect a lot coming out of Europe in terms of growth, and that is before you take into account Brexit. I don't know how Brexit is going to affect things, but it does create uncertainty, and uncertainty typically is not a positive for the economy. China expected to have slow growth, and it's amazing that you say slow growth when 7% is sort of the benchmark there. That would be very strong growth if it was United States, but for China that is considered to be slow. It is slowing. And then emerging markets are so heavily dependent on commodity pricing. With oil and other commodities reacting the way they are, we don't see a lot coming out of emerging markets to lift us out of the sort of 2% growth trend. Other factors, we have a strong dollar, which makes exports difficult. And we do have an export economy here in North Carolina, at least to some extent. Potential for rising interest rates. So anything that benefits from, accessible financing could lag. Could be the auto industry, housing. We'll have to see. And then manufacturing and agriculture are unlikely to improve dramatically. He had charts showing sort of the staple crops, all corn and soy and hogs, all at the very bottom of the sort of 5-year pricing averages. And of course, North Carolina has a very strong agricultural industry, so that may not be something that we can rely on to lift us above 2%. However, there is some good news. The Case-Shiller Housing Index saw some pricing increases, but in all, still below pre-recession, except Charlotte was one of the 7 cities in the U.S. which is above pre-recession heights. So I take that as a very good indicator for North Carolina as a state. I was in Charlotte recently. I don't often go to Charlotte, and it doesn't have anything to do with housing necessarily, but I was amazed at the number of cranes on the skyline in the city of Charlotte. I took that as sort of good anecdotal news for Charlotte and the rest of the state. Infrastructure investment. What is North Carolina going to do in terms of infrastructure? Could Connect NC contribute to economic growth? Probably not on any kind of large scale. The whole bond initiative is $2 billion in a $510 billion GDP economy. Probably not going to move the needle. So I'm not sure that infrastructure is really going to play a huge role in North Carolina. Business spending. We've seen a lot of sales and acquisitions in North Carolina. Belk, a notable one recently. But are companies going to do real investment, or are they just going to continue to kind of churn within their own sector. And then service and manufacturing. Are we going to see service sector gains outpace manufacturing slack? So this is sort of the picture in North Carolina, employment by industry. Is the service sector going to lift us? You do see some pretty strong professional business services relative to manufacturing. You know, where is the trend going to be? Is that going to continue? I don't know. We are very dependent on manufacturing. As you can see, you know, roughly 20% of our labor force is manufacturing, or GDP share. So we'll see. In terms of exporting, again, the dollar's strong, and China is one of our top 5 export markets. So that could be sort of a you know, could suppress growth in the export market for us. So anyway, to get down to it, revenue outlook for 2016-2017 is good, you know, projected to be moderate, 3.9% revenue growth, GDP up, wages up, retail sales up, but not at alarming rates or anything to get terribly excited about. But it is continued growth, and that shouldn't be taken for granted. I don't know that other states would be faring quite as well. So anyway, this time I'll take some questions.
Okay, questions and comments. John?
I have a couple of technical questions. One of them is that the assets and liabilities of the state, you went through some of it. You still have some long-term concerns, particularly the state employee health plan and the obligations that the state has encumbered and has taken on for future retirees, state employees and teachers. That number, I think, according to the last estimate I saw, was about a $27 billion unfunded liability for health benefits. We could debate whether our pension fund's in good shape. In the long run, we clearly have a tens of millions of dollars problem that is not going to go away. I mean, we've got to chip away at it. So I wonder if the administration's been talking about any ways to chip away at it. And then the other specific technical question, I noticed, and I know the state controller is an independent entity, but for years they've been putting out monthly general fund statements to describe where the budget is and the revenues are every month, and I haven't seen that updated since May. Do you have any idea why they're not generating those regular reports?
On the second question, I don't know why, but I can follow up with you. On the first question, so the health plan is controlled by the Treasurer's Office, and there's an executive director of the health plan. So I'd defer any specifics to them, but I do sit on the state health plan board as a non-voting member. It is more of a pay-as-you-go type arrangement. Benefits, post-employment benefits particularly, are, you know, they have a huge tail, and it is, you know, healthcare is not, and those costs are not going down, and our employment base and retirees are getting older and older and consuming more services. So it is definitely on the mind of the administration, and I'm sure the General Assembly. You saw that in the prior year budget. The General Assembly set up a $71 million reserve that would be released to the state health plan as an employer contribution to the premiums if the state health plan got cost increases under control. So they have been plugging along at about a 5%, 6% year-over-year cost increase on the employer side, and that was projected to, in 18-19, increase dramatically. And so in the prior budget, General Assembly set up that reserve account as a carrot, as an incentive to get costs down. Through a combination of higher than anticipated drug rebates and some magic from the consultants, I guess, those costs are anticipated to climb under 4% year over year for the next couple of years. So I shouldn't attribute it to magic of the consultants. I said it tongue in cheek, but they went to a model of a drug formulary. So only certain drugs that are prescribed to the beneficiaries will be reimbursed. And that and the drug rebates significantly reduced the drug cost, which was a big driver for the overall cost.
Take the state budget and divide it by GDP, a percent of GDP, or I guess that's the right terminology, the state economy. How do we currently stack up versus where we were in the past under other administrations, and how do we stack up versus other states?
I don't know. I can say that we've had in the past 3 years pretty measured growth. I think the benchmark of population plus inflation has been maintained under Director Pope and Director Roberts and now with me. In terms of percentage, I would imagine that it's stayed pretty. Has it gone down?
The spending has gone up slower than GDP.
Okay.
So the share of North Carolina's GDP that goes to state government has gone down substantially over the last 10 years. Not quite a percentage.
With the economy improving, I was just wondering how it compared to
Other states?
well, farther than
It's
that.
actually lower. As I recall the number, it's almost around 4% of GDP. It has traditionally been more like 5. So that is actually a substantial reduction.
And versus other states.
That one I haven't computed, but if you use state and local taxes as a percentage of GDP as a kind of a rough guesstimate, we're probably still a little lower than the national average. Tennessee and South Carolina will be lower. Georgia will be about the same. Virginia will be higher.
Director, we've heard a lot of talk about the mission of efficiency. Could you talk a little bit about how, if or how you're seeing that play out in terms of budgeting or employees or boards and commissions, whatever, the tangible requirements for actually getting services delivered?
I know that has been, so the governor had, right from the start, promoted efficiency. I know that we had, Joe Coletti worked on the NC Gear project, and they identified some opportunities there. And perhaps you could even speak to those in a second. But I can tell you what we did at the Industrial Commission. That was a centerpiece of what we tried to do there. So when we came in 2013, we had everything was filed. All the filings associated with the 75,000 claims filed annually were done via paper. We set up a clerk's office, so it's essentially a statewide court system. We set up an office of the clerk of the commission, and we set up electronic filing rules that required everything to be electronically filed. So just anytime somebody had to mail something, it costs money. Print something, it costs money. Handle a paper, it costs money. And so we were able to really drive some efficiencies there. We also had about 22 judges who all resided in Raleigh in the headquarters in the Dobbs building. They fanned out across the state to hold hearings, their trials. They'd stay in hotels. They'd incur meal expenses, mileage reimbursement, and then the soft costs associated with driving from, say, Asheville to Raleigh and back. When they're in the car doing that, they're not entering orders, reviewing cases, etc. So we set up 5 regional offices centered around the major cities in North Carolina. That cut down on the reimbursement expenses. We were able to provide better customer service because the judge was in the community and knew the players there and was accessible. And we were able to reduce the number of judges from 20 down to 22. So those are just a couple of examples of how, I can only assume that statewide that is happening based on the caliber of folks that the governor has leading his state agencies. I don't know the details, but DHHS, for example, budget overruns for years. Now they're coming in under budget. Some of that's attributable to higher investments in DHHS. Some of that's attributable to better forecasting. But I know that Secretary Brazier is very cognizant of his costs and trying to prevent Medicaid fraud, things of that nature. So yes, that is something that the governor is very interested in.
Tony?
One thing I notice, we hear it all the time, is that the I guess, economy nationwide is very anemic. So is that helpful to us? In other words, will companies be more interested, let's say, coming to North Carolina because overall the nation is not doing well? Is that a positive? I don't know if I'm answering that properly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you want to see the silver lining there, that would be one area. I believe one of the business journals in Dallas released a study or wrote a piece about a study that looked at a 7-year period, looked at California, because California experienced a historic migration or outflow of businesses. Some 9,000 businesses or business expansions left the state of California, and they singled out North Carolina as being one of the primary beneficiaries. And that's interesting to note because North Carolina, usually when you see that trend, the states surrounding California would benefit. So it was interesting that North Carolina was one of the major beneficiaries there. The California study was done by a California firm, and it noted that the high costs in California and the hostility to the business climate in California drove that exodus. And I have to think that what we've done here in North Carolina in terms of increasing in the best states for business and cutting taxes and so forth have contributed to us receiving some of those businesses.
John?
It's kind of a follow-up to that. You may have seen yesterday or the day before in the News and Observer, there was a column, an op-ed by John Conterno arguing that the Carolina comeback is a myth. And there was a lot of statistics that, so you led with a number of references to GDP growth and job growth and income growth. And in his piece, Conterno uses a lot of the same types of measures starting in 2007 and arguing that this shows that North Carolina's much vaunted Carolina comeback is not real. So in your expert opinion, what year was Pat McCrory elected governor?
I don't think it was 2007. And there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? So he, as you pointed out, went back to the high water mark of pre-recession era, and we haven't, we are still in the comeback. I mean, if you look at the trend since Governor McCrory took office in 2013, it is undeniably positive on all of the leading economic indicators.
If Donald Trump or a Republican right now tried to go after Clinton by saying she was part of the Obama administration, and since 2007 the economy has done poorly under President Obama, they would be ridiculed and attacked by the media, right?
I can only speculate. And as the national economy has a trend, and as Mattoon pointed out, there's pockets of strength and weakness. And I think undeniably North Carolina is a strong performer as compared to the national economy. Yes?
Just to piggyback on that, to what extent can the state economists at Budget Management isolate North Carolina policies and their effects on North Carolina economics within that larger picture of the national trend? What approaches do they take to kind of pinpoint those real drivers?
Well, I think that would be difficult to do. But when you look at what we've done in terms of tax reform and climbing in the rankings nationally, I think you can deduce a cause and effect. In terms of isolating specific policies or, a tax cut in year one led to job growth in year two, I think that would be, I don't know that we are equipped to do that. But if you have specific questions, we may be able to.
Yes.
Just
much North Carolina's recovery has surpassed the national trend of recovery?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are rankings that are published. There's static figures like year-over-year GDP growth. Tax revenue is a good indicator. Number of jobs created. Those are the type of things that we look at, that credit rating agencies look at, that business journals look at. Those are the data points.
What are the rankings that you were talking about?
Um,
Talking about Business Journal?
Well, you've got GDP growth, you've got personal income growth, which is a component of GDP. You have jobs created. You run each of those on, as Drew was saying, on a year-to-year basis. You can either use the most recent annual data, or you can run it up. In some cases, you've got them every month or every quarter. And so each of those, you just compare them against the national performance, the national trend, and see what the difference is. And you ought to compare it against the southeastern trend, because it could be that North Carolina's just embedded in a region that's doing better. And so you couldn't attribute that to anything that Governor McCoy or the legislature did or didn't do. It's just part of a region. So I would argue you can compare against the national average and the regional.
Okay, last question, yes.
I think you mentioned that most of the revenue growth had come from income, from new jobs and so forth, but regarding the broadening of the sales taxes that the legislature did, taxes on movie tickets and so forth, you know what the split was between the growth in tax revenue from broadening the base versus income growth or job growth?
So, in the last budget, additional services were made subject to the sales tax. Is that what you're referring to? And then there were some adjustments made in this budget as well. What we saw was that income tax and that sales tax was the primary driver. And it's important to note that North Carolina taxpayers on the whole are paying less taxes even with the increase in the number of services that are being taxed. So the reduction in the personal income tax rate coupled with the standard deduction increase means that the average North Carolina taxpayer is paying less now than they were pre-2013. But I don't have the specific dollar amount in terms of how much the increase in services subject to sales tax contributed. But we do have that information at OSBM, and I can provide it to you.